Harvest Master Olun-Ve had processed the biomass of 41 worlds in his 300-year career, and he had never once needed a lifeboat until the night humanity proved him catastrophically wrong. His flagship, the Threshing Wind, had entered Terran space with the same calm efficiency it used on every world before it, confident that a species built barely 2 centuries into spaceflight would offer nothing but the mild inconvenience of panic before the harvest began. 6 hours later, Olun-Ve stood in a cramped, spinning lifeboat with 11 surviving crew members, watching his entire fleet die in silence beyond the viewport, and understood, far too late, that he had made the single worst miscalculation of his very long life. But this ending had not been written the moment his fleet arrived. It had been written decades earlier, in a decision his own people never bothered to investigate, because the Skarn Consortium did not waste time studying species it had already decided were beneath its notice. 3 weeks before that final night, the Threshing Wind crossed into Terran territory with the same confidence it always carried, and nothing about that crossing suggested it would be the last mistake the Consortium ever made. The Skarn Consortium was not an empire that conquered through war. It fed through harvest, a practice so ancient and normalized within Consortium culture that its architects no longer thought of it as cruelty at all. Every few centuries, Consortium scout ships identified worlds advanced enough to be worth processing, but not yet advanced enough to defend themselves, and harvest fleets followed, extracting biomass and resources with the same detached efficiency a farmer might apply to a field of grain. Species too primitive to resist were harvested outright. Species too advanced were quietly avoided, marked permanently off limits after the Consortium's early history had taught it, at devastating cost, how badly a harvest could go wrong against an enemy capable of fighting back. Humanity, according to the scouting reports Olun-Ve reviewed before departure, fell firmly into the first category, a young species with primitive fusion technology and none of the unified defense networks that made a world too costly to touch. The report had been compiled 60 years earlier by a probe that observed exactly one human colony ship, unarmed and struggling, and extrapolated an entire civilization's military capacity from that single data point. It was, Olun-Ve would later admit under interrogation, the laziest piece of intelligence work in Consortium history, and it had cost him everything. What the 60-year-old probe had not seen was the quiet, relentless transformation Earth had undergone in the decades since. The colony ship it observed had indeed been unarmed and struggling, launched when Earth's governments were still fractured and its defenses still theoretical. But that vulnerability had triggered something in humanity's collective memory no Consortium analyst had studied. A species with a long, brutal history of being caught unprepared by its own wars, determined never again to let weakness be visible to anyone watching from beyond its borders. Admiral Kestrel Voss, commander of what would become the sole defense fleet, had spent 2 decades building that fleet in near total secrecy, aware that any premature display of strength might provoke exactly the aggression it was meant to prevent. "We do not announce what we can do," she told her officers in the fleet's earliest years. "We only show it to whoever is foolish enough to force our hand." She never expected to need that doctrine against a species calling itself the Skarn Consortium. She simply expected, with grim certainty, that someone eventually would test it. The Threshing Wind's arrival triggered exactly the quiet, invisible response Voss had spent 2 decades preparing for. Sol defense sensors detected the fleet the moment it crossed the outer boundary. 6 massive harvester vessels escorted by a modest cruiser screen, moving with the unhurried confidence of a force that had never encountered meaningful resistance. Voss watched patiently as the Threshing Wind dispatched automated harvesting drones toward the nearest inhabited system, a mid-sized colony called New Meridian, home to just under 2 million civilians. The drones descended without warning, deploying extraction fields designed to strip biomass with mechanical indifference to the screaming population below. For the first 90 minutes, everything proceeded exactly as Olun-Ve expected. Then the drones began, one by one, to simply stop, their control signals severed with a precision that suggested not damage, but deliberate, surgical interruption. "Someone is jamming the harvest network," his tactical officer reported, confusion evident in her voice, because in 300 years of harvesting, no species this young had ever managed anything close to that level of interference. Olun-Vei's confusion deepened into alarm when New Meridian's own defense systems activated, not the primitive planetary shields his scouting report predicted, but a layered network of interceptors and ground-based weapons platforms that tore through his remaining drones with a coordination that felt, to his tactical staff, disturbingly rehearsed. It was rehearsed. New Meridian, like every human colony established after the fractured early expansion his probe had witnessed, had been quietly built with defensive infrastructure baked into its foundational design, born from decades of collective anxiety about exactly this kind of first contact. What Olun-Vei did not yet understand was that New Meridian's defenses were never meant to be the deciding factor. They were meant to buy time, 63 minutes exactly, for the fleet quietly converging on his position from 3 directions to arrive undetected. That truth stunned Olun-Vei more than any weapon could have. An entire Terran battle fleet, 31 warships strong, had been sitting silent and cloaked at the edges of the Sol defense perimeter, waiting with a discipline no consortium doctrine had ever accounted for. Voss gave the order to decloak, and the threshing wind sensors lit up with contacts on every side, a perfect, inescapable encirclement. "Hold position," Voss's voice came over an open channel, calm and utterly without malice. "You have 30 seconds to power down your extraction systems, and explain why you believed our people were yours to take." Olun-Vei, still convinced his fleet's raw tonnage could overwhelm whatever force this was, gave the order to fire instead. It was the last order of its kind he would ever give. The battle that followed was not the massacre Olun-Vei had built his entire career, expecting to inflict on lesser species. It was the massacre he received. Terran weapons, developed over 2 decades specifically to counter consortium shielding and armor, tore through his fleet's defenses with a precision that suggested his enemy had studied consortium technology far more thoroughly than his own people had ever studied theirs. Ship after harvester vessel lost power, disabled rather than destroyed wherever possible, because Voss's standing orders prioritized restraint over annihilations whenever restraint remained viable. It was not mercy born of weakness. It was mercy born of confidence, the calm certainty of a commander who no longer needed to prove anything by killing everyone in front of her. Within 11 minutes, 5 of the 6 harvester vessels drifted powerless in the dark, their crews alive but stripped of every capability that had once made them predators. The 6th, Olun-Vei's own flagship, held out 4 minutes longer, through sheer stubbornness, before its engines failed, and its shields collapsed entirely, leaving the threshing wind dead in space at the mercy of the very species it had come to consume. Olun-Vei ordered the lifeboats prepared before Voss's boarding party could even reach his bridge, some final, bitter instinct telling him his crew's survival depended on getting off that ship before the humans decided restraint had limits after all. What he found instead was not the vengeful slaughter 3 centuries of consortium doctrine had taught him to expect from a conquered enemy. It was Admiral Voss herself, unarmed, standing in the wreckage of his own command deck with an expression that held no triumph, only a weary, watchful patience. "We're not going to kill you," she told him before he could even ask. "We considered it, but dead harvesters can't tell the rest of your consortium what happened here, and I would very much like your people to understand exactly why crossing our border was the worst decision in your species' long history." Olun-Vei, stripped of every advantage he had ever relied on, found himself doing something he had not done in 3 centuries of harvesting: listening. What Voss told him over the following hours, delivered without cruelty but without softening either, was the full accounting of humanity's long hard-earned transformation from the fractured, vulnerable species his 60-year-old scouting report described into something the consortium had never bothered to update its records to reflect. She told him about the decades of quiet preparation, the deliberate concealment of strength, the doctrine built entirely around the principle that a species caught unprepared once should never allow itself to be caught unprepared again. She told him, too, about New Meridian's civilians, still shaken but alive, thanks to a defense network built specifically to buy time against exactly the kind of threat his fleet represented. And she told him, finally, that humanity had no interest in becoming what the consortium was, a civilization that fed on the weakness of others, but had every interest in making certain no one ever again mistook restraint for an inability to fight back. Humanity.They, listening in the wreckage of his own flagship, felt something he had not experienced in 300 years of effortless, unchallenged harvest, the specific, disorienting humility of discovering that the galaxy still had room for surprises even a species as old as his own had never accounted for. The 11 surviving harvester vessels, crippled but intact, were escorted out of Terran space 3 weeks later, under close Sol defense guard, their crews unharmed but permanently changed by what they had witnessed. Humanity returned to consortium space, not as a conquering harvest master, but as a cautionary figure, whose report ended the consortium's harvest operations in that sector permanently, marking Terran space with the same off-limits designation once reserved for species too dangerous to touch. Admiral Voss, for her part, never spoke publicly of the battle with anything resembling pride, treating it as a failure of diplomacy rather than a triumph of arms, a reminder that humanity's survival had depended not on seeking conflict, but on being ready enough that conflict, when it finally arrived, ended in minutes rather than years. New Meridian's civilians, once terrified and defenseless beneath consortium drones, became the first human colony to petition for full integration into the Sol Defense Fleet's officer training programs, determined never again to be the reason a battle needed fighting at all. Years later, historians studying the Threshing Wind incident would point to it as the moment humanity's careful, decades-long doctrine of hidden strength finally proved its worth. A quiet validation of every sacrifice and every year of secrecy that went into building a fleet the galaxy never saw coming. Admiral Voss grew old aboard that same flagship, and in her final years she told young officers, gathered around her like students at the feet of a teacher, that the true victory of that night was not the 11 crippled ships that limped home in shame. It was the 2 million lives on New Meridian, who never had to learn what it felt like to be harvested, who got to grow old themselves instead, ignorant of how close the end had come. That, she said, was the only kind of victory worth building a fleet for. But not every question from that night was ever answered, and one of them haunted Voss until the day she died. Buried in the debriefing files she filed, after Humanity.They's fleet limped home, one detail remained deliberately unresolved, sealed under her own personal authority, for reasons she never fully explained even to her closest officers. The Threshing Wind's logs, recovered during the boarding, contained navigational data suggesting the consortium's original scouting probe had not stumbled onto Earth's earliest colony ship by accident at all. It had been directed there, deliberately, by a signal source the consortium's own records could not identify, broadcast from somewhere far beyond either species-mapped territory. Voss ran that signature against every database Sol Defense possessed and found nothing. Only a single unsettling constant. The same signal, fainter and older, buried in sensor logs from 3 other first contact incidents across the galaxy, each ending the same way this one nearly had. Something out there had been watching long before humanity ever left its own solar system, patient enough to have engineered this confrontation from the shadows, and patient enough, Voss feared in her last recorded log entry, to still be watching now. She never learned who, or what, sent that signal. She only left behind a warning, quiet and unfinished. Humanity had survived its first real test. But somewhere in the dark beyond every border it had ever mapped, the true harvester was still out there, and it had not shown its hand yet.